Good afternoon. It's shortly after 1 o'clock here in Perth in Western Australia, and I welcome you to the online webinar that will be dealing with the topic of the Biden presidency and the implications for the US, China and Australian relations. So you're very welcome wherever you are tuning in this afternoon, or indeed if it's morning or evening, depending on your local time zone. My name is Shamit Sagar, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this discussion. I'm the director of the University of Western Australia Public Policy Institute. And for those of you not in the know, the Policy Institute's job primarily is to, first of all, ensure that the world-class research of this university is properly and suitably connected to the worlds of policymakers, commerce and non-profits. And second of all, we spend a fair bit of our time with our illustrious academic colleagues dealing with aspects of thought leadership, and some of those have to do with life here in WA and Australia, and a fair number of the issues that crop up on the policy landscape here in Australia have to do with our relationship with our neighbours, our hemisphere, and hence, for that matter, why we're gathered this afternoon. Today's event combines the efforts of the Policy Institute that I head up, but in addition, the Australia Institute for International Affairs, the Western Australian branch, the Australian Centre for Transcultural Studies, and the Beijing Foreign Service University. So there's a number of collaborators, and in particular, if I can just thank Greg McCarthy, who will be popping up in a moment, for getting this off the ground in less than a month. So delighted to host this afternoon. Can I just now move on before we do anything else, and as is our custom at UWA, to signal the Noongar acknowledgement, and if I may read that out. The University of Western Australia acknowledges that the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional owners of the land on which it is situated at its Crawley campus. The Whadjuk Noongar people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land and continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs and knowledge. I'm therefore, on behalf of the university, very privileged and honoured to pay my respects to their leaders and elders, past, present and future. Thank you. We have in this topic a gargantuan number of issues, and that's why we've assembled a very crack team indeed to interrogate what lies beneath the surface. But can I just, before we go any further, just offer, as I often do, just a couple of quick observations about how this landscape may look at this point in time, not just here from Australia, but actually from a number of capitals. The first thing is there's an enormous amount of attention that's now going into post-Monday of this week, the composition of this new administration in Washington. It is a kind of custom or season. Every time there's a change of presidency, a lot of attention goes to who gets which job, and the personnel then gives us, as it were, a head start. And this is no different. This probably has taken place a little bit quicker than many people in the Republican Party had envisaged, but we now are obviously heading straight towards an orderly transition, and therefore there's quite a lot to get to grips with, and I'm sure members of the panel will bring up aspects of how that view of the world from Washington will be steered by particular members of the new administration, many of whom have been talked about endlessly in the press elsewhere this week. But can I also make a larger point, which I'm very hopeful that our discussion will get to as well, and that I'm confident that it will, which goes to some of the issues behind why it is at this moment in time Australia finds itself deeply and in some senses horribly cross-pressured. It's quite a palpable sense in discussions around foreign affairs and even around aspects of domestic politics here in Australia. And I do think it's quite important to remember that some of the commentary that's gone on also makes a very important point, and it was echoed very clearly by Nagia Woods from the Blavatnik School earlier this week, when she talked about China, of course, is competing with the United States, as well was her point, within a framework of post-war institutions and rules that the US largely built. Point one. And point two, to remind ourselves that China itself is building its own institutions at one and the same time. So both these things need to be taken into account before we sort of excessively dwell upon one aspect or another. So I'm keen that our discussion deals with both the foreground aspects of the relationship, whether it's personnel or priorities, but also in the background, these tectonic plates that go a long way towards explaining the US in the Indo-Pacific, in particular, the relationship between Australia and China and the US. Now, you didn't tune in to hear from me about this. We've got an illustrious team, as I mentioned, who will take us through this. But can I just quickly introduce who will be coming up in a moment? We are co-chairing, or my co-chair for this discussion, I'm very pleased to say, is Professor Amanda Davis, who's the head of the School of Social Sciences at UWA. You'll be hearing from her in a short moment. In addition, we have another one of my colleagues, Professor Mark Beeson from Political Science at UWA. Thirdly, we have Dr. Dan Hu, who is a professor at Beijing Foreign Service University, who we'll be hearing from. Professor Gordon Flake, the CEO, inaugural CEO of the Perth US Asia Center, based here at UWA. Fifthly, Professor Yan Rui Wu, who is a professor in the economics discipline in the business school at UWA. And then lastly, Professor Zi Tao, who's the Dean of the International Relations and Diplomacy Program at the Beijing Foreign Service University. These are all people we'll be hearing from in the substance and the chairing in a moment. So can I, without any further ado, ask my colleague, the Vice President of Beijing Foreign Service University, Professor Yuzhan Sung, to address the audience and the panel, and he'll be followed in a short moment by Greg McCarthy. Professor Sung, could you address us?
Okay, so thank you, Professor Saga. Dear cats and eggs friends, old and new, good afternoon. 7 years ago, in 2013, Professor Greg McCarthy, Xianing Song, Nick Jones, and I co-founded the China-Australia Transcultural Studies Symposium in Beijing, here at Beijing Foreign Studies University, not Foreign Studies Service University. Let me correct you, Professor Saga. We agreed to host this very special forum, and we nicknamed it Cats If Held in China and Acts in Australia. Today, we are celebrating what has grown to be the 8th year along the line, the longest running annual event for scholarly exchange between China and Australia. I'm very delighted and encouraged that COVID-19 has not inhibited us from getting together. It has only ways of exchanging ideas and sharing our findings. I would like to thank Professor Greg for everything you have done to make this happen under these very special circumstances. Last November, we received 100 guests from China, Australia, and Britain during the 2019 CATS in Beijing, and discussed for 2 days topics of common interest across areas of international relations, transcultural studies, economics, education, and literature. I'd like to share with you a very encouraging piece of news that we are compiling the papers for last year's conference, and it will be published by Springer very soon. Thank you, Greg. Acts 2020 wouldn't happen without the steady support of Public Policy Institute, as well as the School of Social Sciences, which I believe clearly demonstrates long-term commitment to academic and education exchange with Chinese universities, a commitment that we share, a commitment that will prove to be instrumental at a time like this. So I'd like to give my sincere thanks to Perth, to Perth, USA, US Asia, and ILA Western Australia for participating and promoting this event. With that, I'd like to wish a great success to today's webinar and extend the welcome to all. We look forward to welcoming everyone in Beijing Foreign Studies University for CATS next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sung. And my apologies for inserting service when I meant studies. But without any further ado, can I swiftly ask Professor Greg McCarthy to address the audience? Greg? He was there a moment ago, I'm absolutely certain. He's back. Greg, you're on mute right now. Greg, look up, you're on mute. Okay, hang on. I'm afraid unless Greg. Greg, can you see me or hear me? No. Okay, well, I think we're going to have to move on. Apologies to Greg, he's got a poor connection and also he was muted. So can we now hand over to my colleague Amanda Davis, who's going to take us through the substance of this afternoon's discussion. Amanda, can you hear me? Are you unmuted?
I am unmuted and we're back on track. So I think we'll move to our next speaker, which is Gordon Flake from the US Asia Centre, and he will be speaking to us for the next 5 minutes. So Gordon, over to you.
Well, thank you, Amanda. Let me also extend my congratulations to Greg McCarthy, to Shamit Sagar, to the Chinese, the Beijing Foreign Studies University for this long collaboration. This is the first year I have an opportunity to be involved, and I'm honored to be part of this discussion. I thought I might just kind of set big picture that will lead to much of the rest of the discussion over the next hour and a half that we've got here. Most of you will know I spent nearly 25 years in Washington, D.C. before moving to the farthest city on the planet on land away from Washington, D.C. some 7 years ago to take over my current position at the Perth US Asia Center. And so I will focus particularly on the Biden transition, what it means for US-China relations, and then in turn what it means for Australia's relations with China. And my overarching theme will be one of caution. Normally, and in most areas of foreign policy, you're going to see a rather sweeping change from what in the United States is a regular pendulum swing. And that regular pendulum swing would switch between Republican and Democratic administrations on a whole range of issues, but primarily on domestic policy issues. Traditionally, there hasn't been stark differences in foreign policy. This year, however, given the unprecedented nature of the last 4 years of President Trump, his America First approach, his deep skepticism, to be charitable, about alliances, his antagonism towards anything multilateral, anything that wasn't bilateral, and anything that didn't recognize his personal primacy as well as the primacy of the country, I anticipate that in general, there is going to be a massive swing, one of the most precipitous swings in American foreign policy that we've ever seen. You've seen it in the last 48 hours coming out of Washington, D.C., being described as America's back. Ironically, our focus today, being on the U.S.-China relationship and then how that impacts Australia-China relations, is the one area where I don't think there will be that much change. And it's funny because much of the attacks from the Trump campaign against then candidate, now President-elect Joe Biden, was that he was soft on China and that he was going to be in China's lap and he was Xi Jinping's lapdog, etc. But the reality is fundamentally different. And there's several things that I would point out that I think are helpful to understand this. Number one, the fundamental changes in both Australia-China relations and U.S.-China relations, and I would add more broadly global relations with China, are more driven by developments in Beijing than developments in Washington, than developments in Australia. We are way past the days when China was a country that was largely impacted by decisions made outside of its borders. China is now of sufficient strength, influence, and importance in the world that it is actually setting the agenda. And unfortunately, at least from my perspective, that means that decisions that have been made in China in recent years have meant that there are difficult relations with almost every one of China's near neighbors, as well as other countries across the globe, and those include the United States and they include Australia. And so because that wasn't something that was driven primarily by Trump, it was something that predated Trump and is driven more out of Beijing, it would be unrealistic for us to expect a fundamental shift. Now, having said that, if the Chinese leadership and the Central Party decide to take it, there is an opportunity in this political transition in the United States for a reset button, for the leadership of China to decide that at a minimum, the volume, the tactics, the vitriol with which the relationship was defined for the last 4 years can be reset, and we can approach it in a different way. And that's something I'm still hopeful that will be taken. So let's look specifically at the Biden administration approach to China. We already know a few things. We know who his national security advisor is going to be, Jake Sullivan. We know that his Secretary of State is going to be Tony Blinken. In general, those appointed to date from the Biden administration have been quiet, low-key, very experienced, highly competent individuals who are known more for their competence than for their public image. And that speaks well for foreign policy writ large. It also speaks well for the U.S.-China relationship. And the reason that is I would argue that during the Trump administration, the U.S. approach to China it was very large on theatrics and very large on attitude, but very weak on strategy. And so there's a lot of people out there who have this narrative somehow that Trump was tough on China and that Trump stood up to China. And we're seeing this today even in Republicans criticizing the new Biden team. But the reality is when it came to difficult issues like ZTE or a bunch of others, Trump was only tough in attitude. He didn't have a strategy. And perhaps most importantly, he ignored the fundamental nature of American power in the world. And it is one that has clearly been misunderstood by the Trump administration. That is, American power was not because of America first, which was interpreted as America alone, but because of the international system, international law, international norms, international organizations, and the networks of alliances. And so in engaging China, President Trump ended up being, a lot of fireworks, a lot of noise, but no strategy, and squandered American influence. So in many respects, that enabled China to avoid the fundamental pressure that many people anticipated would be placed upon China given some deep disputes in terms of the trading system, the rules of the trading system, and China's role in that process. I personally don't believe that's good for China. I don't think the Trump relationship was good for China, for Chinese consumers, for Chinese economy, or China's role in the world, and I think we've seen that. So in that regard, I am hopeful. I am hopeful that a lowering of the volume, a lowering of the temperature of the discussion will allow some recalibration in China. I am confident that if you look at the priority that was placed on putting former Secretary of State, former Senator, former presidential candidate John Kerry in a climate change position, and the clear messaging coming out of the Biden camp that they need to be able to work with China on issues like North Korea, on climate change, on global health, that we're going to find a more balanced relationship than we've had and a more strategic relationship than we've had over the last 5 years. The only difference is it won't be problem-free. The fundamentals are still going to be something that we're going to have to wrestle with. And so in that context, I actually think it'll be relatively easier for Australia to calibrate its own relationship, just because, when you're dealing with something that is more transparent, more in line with what Australians will call the rules-based order, I think in the end it will be an easier calibration for Australia to make. So I've quickly gone up to 5 minutes. I've got a lot more to say, but I'll hold that for the discussion. Pardon me for going a little bit too long. I'll turn it back to you, Amanda.
Gordon, thank you very much for that. Some excellent thoughts and quite a bit of positivity, caged, of course, like with some parameters. a fairly positive message on some aspects there. I'd like now to ask Professor Tao Shi to speak, who's from Political Science and International School of International Relations and Diplomacy, sorry, and he's going to speak to us on some other aspects.
Okay, great, Amanda. Thanks for hosting this. Gordon already has said quite a few points. I agree. First, I agree with him that we should really exercise a lot of caution in evaluating the new administration, the Joe Biden administration. I think the consensus here is, to use a metaphor, China's U.S.-China relationship during the Trump administration was very much like a boxing game. You have two very strong men, muscular, and they're fighting against each other. It's a game of kind of raw power. And with this new administration, you are going to probably see more of shadow boxing, like in Chinese, we call this Taiji. And Taiji means, the Biden team, they're more like Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, whom I met once in Beijing. These people are more sophisticated. They're much more experienced. They could be much more diplomatic. In other words, they could have much more statecraft instead of Donald Trump's impulsive, emotional policy making. And so in that sense, Joe Biden team could be even harder team for the Chinese leaders to deal with. Right? So I agree with Gordon Flake on that assessment. Second point I want to make is about, what do we expect of the Biden administration? Like I said on Monday during the pre-panel session, my own sense is that Biden would not be a foreign policy president, even though he was a foreign policy vice president. But now he has this presidency of his own, and he surrounded himself with all these top diplomats you can find in Washington, D.C. Because I say this because of this campaign, which has been so divisive, and America has been so divided. And with Donald Trump, even make this more exacerbated the whole thing. So I think, Biden's hands will be fully occupied by quite a few very pressing domestic challenges. One is racial justice. Second, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, like the squad member, Bernie Sanders, they have been pressing the Biden administration to incorporate some of these more progressive, maybe I would say more radical elements of the Democratic Party, include their agenda in his policy, such as one, to cancel the college debt, which is close to $1.7 trillion. And Biden also needs to address this very pressing illegal immigration problem. He also needs to take care of the economy. New York Stock Exchange has hit another record number, but these are largely jobless growth. And these are numbers mostly for rich people. And for ordinary people, they still need a job. So you need to create more jobs. And so to put all this together, I would say that the Biden presidency would, at least in the first or maybe the second year, that is 2020 and 22, he will have perhaps very little time to have kind of a whole reevaluation and a reset of US foreign policy. And that means he would have even less time for dealing with China. Second, if past is any indication of the future, and so you look at these old hands from the Obama administration, Blinken, Sullivan, and many others. And so you would think that Joe Biden, if he does have time to think about his China policy, he would perhaps carry more of Barack Obama's China policy. And we all know this started with this so-called pivot to Asia, which was later renamed the Rebalance to Asia in order to soften its aggressive and strategic tone. And so that means the Biden administration could spend more efforts revamping its alliances in Asia Pacific. That includes obviously Australia, Japan, South Korea, and some other Southeastern Asian countries. And so in that sense, this could be good news for Australia. It's an opportunity for Canberra to strengthen its alliance with the United States. The fourth point I want to make is about public opinion. Now, if you do believe those public opinion numbers, I say do believe because look at 2016 and 2020. It seems like there's a huge problem with this polling industry in the United States, and there's this I would not say it's a crisis, but there's a growing skepticism about the use and accuracy of public opinion polls, right? Nevertheless, you look at Gallup data, and American public views of China is now the most negative since 1973 or 1974. Today is even worse than how American public felt about China in the aftermath of 1989. So today, only about 33% of Americans had a favorable view of China, whereas 67% of them had negative views of China. I used to spend a lot of time researching American public opinion on China. It seems to me that this could take quite a few years or maybe a full decade for American public to fully, warming up again with Beijing. So that's my fourth point. My last point is that you look at Biden, when he was running for the presidency during the primary election, he published an article in Foreign Affairs, which is entitled, "Why America Must Lead the World Again." So Biden is no less determined than Donald Trump or any other American president to maintain America's unchallenged leadership in global affairs. And that means America under Barack Obama or Donald Trump or Biden would still be firmly committed to continue America's global leadership. And so this, in my view, would put Washington on a kind of a collision course with some of Beijing's policy objectives, including the Belt and Road and other initiatives, which from Chinese point of view may be natural, but from America's point of view, this is a threat to America's global leadership. And so in that sense, if Biden really wants to continue that kind of a global leadership, to re-energize America's global influence, and so he could be even more aggressive, especially in rebuilding America's influence in international institutions, such as the UN and IMF and WTO and other organizations. And so this could mean there could be more disputes, agreements, and tensions with China in these international institutions. One of our guests already mentioned that, these post-Second War institutions, China is also building up its own institutions like the AIIB and others, right? So in a word, I'm not very optimistic. On the contrary, I tend to be more pessimistic about the short-term US-China relationship. If we are expecting to see a major reset, we probably have to wait until after the 2022 US congressional elections. So these are the points I want to throw out, for the first part of the our panel, and I would be happy to continue our discussion later on. But back to you, Amanda.
Thank you very much, Professor Xi. Some very interesting insights there. We might expect to see some more diplomacy in the sort of diplomatic area with a bit of increased competency. However, a very large domestic agenda that will face Biden in his presidency may curtail his capacity, as you're saying. We've so far had two speakers both putting some very interesting thoughts forward, and so I'd like to invite those listening to submit some questions through the question and answer function, and we will be able to use and review some of those questions and put them to the panel later in this session today. So please think about your questions and start submitting them as we go to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Mark Beeson, who is from the University of Western Australia. So straight over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much, Amanda. I've got a terrible internet connection, it seems. So if you can't hear me, give me a little wave. And I could always switch off the video if the signal's not too great, but I'll press on until I see any difference. But I'd like to agree with both Gordon and Antao's remarks about the chance for a reset of relations between
China and the United States in particular, and also potentially between Australia and America and China as well. And I think the fact that the US has now got a new administration and a leader who's potentially interested in engaging with the world, values the importance of multilateral institutions, is unambiguously a good thing, particularly for a country like Australia, which historically has been very dependent on the successful functioning of multilateral institutions, because less powerful states depend on those kind of institutions to keep very powerful states in order. And that applies as much to the United States as it does to China. And I think if the Trump administration has demonstrated anything, it's the importance of America observing the rules and being a part of the so-called rules-based international order as much as China should be. And this is something of a problem for, or a mixed blessing for Australia, because while Trump was president, they received fairly unambiguous and fulsome support from the Australian government, even when Trump was trashing the so-called rules-based international order that America did so much to initially establish. So that wasn't a terribly good look. It's great that the Americans do seem to be keen on taking multilateralism seriously again, and that they're going to try and provide some international leadership, particularly in the area of climate change. And I think the appointment of John Kerry as the so-called climate envoy or ambassador is an extremely good move, at least symbolically, if nothing else. But it's going to be a bit problematic for Australia, because Australia's environmental record is pretty awful. And I think the Americans are going to understandably and welcomely, in my view, put pressure on Australia to actually do something about its own environmental record and put its money where its mouth is. And they might find themselves coming under some unfamiliar pressure to act in ways that they won't find politically comfortable or easy. So that's going to be something of a problem. In my view, the thing that middle powers like Australia can do is to try to put pressure on the great powers to behave well. And as I say, that includes, that applies just as much to the United States as it does to China. I think one thing that the Australians and other middle powers could do is to come up with useful and potentially feasible ideas about what could be done on issues like climate change. And I think one of the things that China and the United States need to recognize, and Australia should encourage them to think about, is that climate change represents a much greater long-term and indeed immediate threat to both countries than they do to each other. In other words, climate change is the most important security issue that both of those countries actually face. So trying to get China and the United States to actually cooperate on those kinds of issues, and maybe they could even have an arms control agreement as part of that cooperation, and dedicate the money they save from that to actually doing something about restructuring their respective economies along sustainable lines. So there are useful contributions that Australia and other middle powers could make in this area if they had the imagination and the political will to do so. At the moment, it's going to be very difficult to do so, because as China takes great pleasure in pointing out, they see Australia as a kind of lackey of the United States with very little capacity to create own independent foreign policy, Morrison's denials notwithstanding. But I think there is some credibility in those criticisms that are made of Australia. And I think to have a more independent policy. Are you waving at me, Amanda? Am I breaking up? Okay.
I am waving at you, yes.
Okay, so I think it's good Australia's reaching out to regional powers like Japan, for example, with the recent trip by Morrison to Japan. I don't think it's quite as encouraging that the rationale for this is overwhelmingly a strategic one, and it will be read in Beijing as an attempt by American allies to contain China's rise, and that's not a great basis for cooperative relationship between Australia and China, or China and the United States for that matter. So they could have a more progressive and positive agenda as part of that situation, I think. So behave well, but Australia doesn't necessarily need to take the lead in this and be quite so far ahead of the curve with the kinds of possibilities for pushback from China that we've seen. But I think it could offer and encourage the Biden administration to take a more constructive attitude towards China, and that would be in everybody's collective interest. And I think the big point I would end on is that whatever we think about China's foreign policy over the last few years, and it hasn't been great, and there's plenty to worry about, but in the long term, China's got to be part of the solution and not just painted as the source of all problems and difficulties.
Mark, thank you very much for that. You broke up a little bit, but I think we did get the majority of what you were saying. And we'll have some questions come through for you on that. So thank you very much. Some really great thoughts, and it's nice to see some commentary there on the climate change matter and how we might deal with that across government. So the next speaker we have is Dr. Dunn, who will talk to us about a slightly different aspect. And so straight over to you, Dr. Hu.
Thank you, Amanda. I have been stuck in Melbourne since January, so I'll just be focusing on China-Australia relations instead of talking too much about the Biden or about China-American relations, which many of the panelists have talked. Hello? So am I all right? I mean, I'm a little bit freezing here. It's all good? Okay, great, thanks. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the future of China-Australia relations, the status quo in the future. And many of the panelists have talked about the security front. And I think they have just pretty much exhausted that. And I think I would agree with them in that we're not seeing any fundamental change to happen anytime soon on the security and strategic front. And also, I'd like to add one thing is that I actually would argue that the Biden's possible approach of this closer grouping of like-minded countries may actually pressurize Australia into more action. So I think that would be that I would expect to see a more contentious relationship between China and Australia in the future. But I would like to focus a bit more on the other things. You said the economic and the people-to-people connections. Because for a long time, we have assumed that this strong and close economic and people-to-people connections between China and Australia has always been served as a ballast. But what we are seeing in the past 2 to 3 years is that it's not a ballast anymore. And on the contrary, they have become easy targets of suspicion and scrutiny. Actually, the more closely related to China or the more closely connected to China, you see the higher the risk. So for this ongoing debate in Australia about economic decoupling, diversification, or deleveraging, however you call it, which took traction right after COVID hit. And I think this whole thing that economic diversification is already happening, especially or perhaps more so in the area of foreign direct investment than foreign trade. Because when we cross-check the FDI databases of Chinese investment to Australia, be it China's MOFCOM data or Australia's ABS or FIRB data, and also in Australia we have the KPMG and AU databases, in America you have the Heritage Foundation database. I think all of them really clearly telling the same story about this huge reduction of Chinese investment to Australia. But I'm not arguing that this decline is really a result of Australia's decision to diversify, because it really happened long before that. But I think this phenomena really brings us to the fundamental of some of the problems in bilateral relations, or the fundamentals of transnational economic relations, which is trust and goodwill. And I just want to remind everyone that in 2014, when Prime Minister Tony Abbott introduced President Xi Jinping's address to the Australian Parliament, he said, we trade people when we need them, but we invest with people when we trust them. Well, you may have your own idea about Abbott as a Prime Minister, but we have to all give him credit for sometimes really neatly summarizing the situation. The thing is, looking at the situation now, I'm afraid that the trend is likely to sustain with the most recent FDI legislation proposal in Australia. I mean, when you take a look at it, it's really it's a highly securitized piece of legislation. And really, already people who are talking about that ASIO is now the investment gatekeeper. So I'd like to end this with a slightly connected, but really something different, but also I would argue is a very important part of the landscape. And Professor Shea was also talking about the public opinion, the opinion poll in America about China. We launched the inaugural poll on China-Australia relations in June 2020, and we sampled about 2,105 respondents in 10 major cities in China, and 80% of them are really defining China as a higher educated and higher income. And just want to share two results which are really interesting, is that when we asked them what is the biggest obstacle in China-Australia relations, 49.5% of them say it's the factor of the US, and 32.5% of them would identify ideological differences, and 13.7% would say domestic politics in Australia. And when we ask them, pretty much like the Lowy question, is to China, Australia is more of an economic partner, or otherwise 66.8% of them would identify Australia to China as more of an economic partner, which is a good sign. But 29.7% would identify Australia as a political or ideological threat, and 3.5% as a military threat. The interesting part about it is when you put it side by side with the Lowy result, and I think it's pretty much the same thing happening in America about this shifting public opinion, which may really take many, many years to turn. So with that as a background, I would have to say I would share the pessimism expressed by many of our panelists today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Dan Hu. That was really very interesting. I feel quite privileged to have had that data that you gave us at the end. I imagine, like myself, people have quite a few questions. So please submit your questions through the forum, and we will get those to Dan in our question time. We have one more speaker left before we can get to our questions. So I'd like to invite the final speaker, which is Dr. Yanrui Wu, Professor Wu, and he'll talk to us. He's from University of Western Australia, and provide a little bit more insight there.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I do have a couple of slides to share with you. As an economist, my focus is on the economic relationship between Australia and China. In the 5 minutes allocated to me, I would like to raise 3 points. The first point I would like to raise is that the economic relationship between Australia and China is very strong, as you can say on this the first chart here. In particular, since the signing of the free trade agreement between the two countries at the end of 2015, as you can see, Australian export to China has been has increased dramatically since during this period. In particular, I want to draw attention to the trade surplus for Australia. So the trade is really in Australia's favor, from around $20 billion during this financial year to the current financial year is around $70 billion. Well, Australian imports from China also maintained a steady rate of growth over the years. Now, this in terms of goods trade. In terms of trading and services, the Australia also enjoy very good surplus, currently around $15 billion. So the relationship is very strong, even though both economies have suffered from COVID-19 and the problems with the political relationship between the two countries. But in the long run, the political relationship will affect the economic relationship, as you can see from the next slides here. Oops. Now, this is the Australian agriculture exports to China in recent years, as I can say, growth has been rapid since the completion of the free trade agreement around 2015. But this year, major changes occurred. I guess there are two factors here: the decline, dramatic decline in the last financial year. One, it's partly because of the COVID-19 impact, and also because of the deteriorating relationship, political relationship between the two countries. So my point, I want to emphasize, that's my second point, that really we need a reset for the political relationship between the two countries. The previous government in Australia under Malcolm Turnbull, he's initiated the so-called reset, but he didn't really deliver the outcome. It's not a reset in the wrong direction. The current government hasn't really talked about the reset, but the reality is economic relationship cannot last forever if we have problem with the political relationship. So that's my second point. My last point, just want to very briefly comment on the impact on Western Australia and China. In recent history in Australia, the state governments within Australia states have played a major role in attracting foreign investment. So, for example, in the 60s, 70s, and states like South Australia and New South Wales played a very important role to bring American investment to Australia. And in the 70s, in the 80s and 90s, Western Australia played a key role to bring Japanese investment. So at that time, the American investment and Japanese investment were not necessarily very popular in the society. But given the current political environment, I don't know whether the states still have the flexibility to deal with foreign governments or not, as they used to do in previous decades. So that's something really the states, policymakers in the states have to face in the coming years. I think I'll stop here. Thank you. Amanda, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And I guess that brings us to the end of our speakers. It was a very interesting way to end with a bit of a focus on Western Australia. I myself, my background and expertise is in regional and rural development, so I spend quite a bit of my time talking to farmers. And in 2017, I shared a flight back from China with some crayfishermen from the coast of Western Australia. There was about 45 crayfishermen who had been in China working on some partnerships there, and it was a very fruitful and a very interesting trip. And when I go out now into regional Western Australia and I spend time with farmers and organisations, their dialogue and communications with their counterparts in China is still very friendly and very fruitful. And it really doesn't seem to align with what we see represented at the governmental level. So from my aspect of my research, it's really interesting to hear everyone's insights into this and how that might unfold for the farmers on the ground in both countries. So we have had quite a number of questions come in, and I'll start directing those out to various people on our panel. So I might start back where we started really, but I'll throw the first question to Professor Xi, if this is okay. Are there any particular lessons that we might learn from the Trump era for all that it was? Is there anything positive that we could learn that might help us shape our relationships going forward?
That's a question for me, right? Mm-hmm.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. If there is a lesson that, at least from my perspective, that we should learn from Trump's 4 years is that, let me put it this way. There used to be this widespread belief in China that it's easier to deal with a Republican than to deal with a Democrat in the White House. The source of that belief is that Republicans, they don't care much about ideology. They care about national security. They care about free trade. So as long as China open up its door and do business with American farmers, exporters, and the U.S.-China economic relationship would be good. But now with Donald Trump in the White House the past 4 years, I think there's this need for us to reassess our past beliefs and assumptions about Republicans' philosophy and their foreign policy. Now, by the same token, of course, we also probably need to reassess our past assumptions and beliefs about Democrats, especially with this new administration of Joe Biden.
Oh, does anyone else have anything to extend on that?
Yeah, let me chime in on that. Something I didn't mention for lack of time in the outset, and this is where I very much agree with Professor Tao Xie. He pointed about public opinion. In democratic societies in particular, it's difficult for a government to get too far out ahead of public opinion. And over the last year in particular, but the last several years, whether it's Canada, Australia, the United States, Japan, India, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, Germany, the UK, every single one of these countries have these rapidly rising negative opinion rates about China. Again, this is what I tried to make the point is about the decisions made in Beijing. It's not something that we fundamentally control, so you shouldn't expect the U.S. to change. But if I can dial down on one aspect of that, having spent 25 years in Washington, D.C., the driving force behind the U.S.-China relationship was always the business community. They were the ones who advocated for most favored nation trading status. They were the ones who advocated passionately for China to be part of the WTO. In Australia today, they're the ones who are still most passionately arguing for the Australia-China relationship. In the United States today, the business community is ambivalent at best, if not hostile. And so that's something we have to understand. Those days are not coming back. The fundamental drivers in society advocating for a closer relationship in terms of the public and in terms of the business community have shifted. And so that makes it a much more challenging environment. So I didn't want to come across as too Pollyannish. I agree with Professor Tao Xie. There are some fundamental challenges. But our tendency in Australia is just to launch into this self-introspection, self-flagellation. What did we say? How did we say it? Could we have said it slightly differently? Maybe if we used a different phrase, it'd be a little bit better, without putting ourselves in a broader context when everybody has the same problem, right? So this is not a Morrison thing or a Trump thing or a Vietnam thing. It's kind of a global reaction to a fundamental challenge that we're all dealing with.
Gordon, on that, we have received a question that really extends on that a little, which is the decline in China's reputation has occurred in most Western countries, and basically, why is that?
So again, I've been to China 30 times. I have so many deep friends in China. This is what I was trying to allude to earlier. I actually think the mishandling by the Trump administration does a great disservice to China. Because if you think about it, the economic reforms that were pushed under MFN status and joining WTO, those all benefited China and Chinese consumers tremendously. The anticipation was that the U.S. would work together with the UK and the others to provide the necessary international pressure to help China move to that next step of reform. Now, the Chinese leadership now has taken a very different direction, right? And again, I can understand their logic, why they've done it, but they've had a very different approach to foreign policy, to security, to territory, and a whole range of issues, which has led to a negative reaction internationally. One that I don't think serves the Chinese people well. I don't think that the average Chinese people are happy about those increasing negative ratings across the world, right? I don't think it serves Chinese economy well. And I think it was made worse by the way it was handled by the United States, but it's not going away. There's underlying factors that really go to the decisions made by the Chinese leadership today.
Can I add one point, Amanda?
Yes, please.
It's interesting to hear Gordon mention the changing role of U.S. business in this. I guess one of the major changes for decades, U.S. business enjoyed absolute competitiveness and advantage in China. And nowadays, suddenly they found there are so many competitors locally. So naturally, they have to change. It's a matter really, both sides, American business and China have to adapt to the new reality.
Yeah, but just to make this more of a dialogue, Professor Wu is exactly correct, right? Yeah, the environment is much more competitive in China. There's a lot of amazing Chinese companies doing great work, but that doesn't explain the dissatisfaction or the antagonism from the U.S. business community. It's really about decisions made by the party in terms of the playing field, right? And so when I talk about the reforms that were anticipated, and if we had an international community that worked together with China to make sure that they lived up to the WTO commitments, that would be a good thing. So Amanda, you pointed out the very specific thing back here in WA, right? If you look at the Chinese trade data that Professor Yu pointed out, he's absolutely correct. The trade relations continue to be really, really good on commodities that China needs, coal, iron ore, LNG, right? But if you're a West Australian, even though your personal relationships with those companies is going really good, and you've been hit by your market concentration on crayfish, on wheat, or barley rather, and more specifically, on wines, on dairy products, those were political decisions. Those were not people-to-people decisions. Those were political decisions, and that type of capricious decision-making is underneath those rising in popularity. So it's not the Chinese people. The average Chinese consumer wants Australian crayfish, and they love Australian barley, and they want Margaret River wines, right? But the politicization of that relationship has then now been reflected in a global negative relationship, and those are party decisions, not company decisions.
I was just going to bring, go ahead, Mark, and then I'll bring in Dr. Dan Hu to put some comments into that too.
Okay, I just wanted to get back to this question about leadership. And I think one of the things that the Trump administration has demonstrated is just how much leadership still matters. And that's kind of surprising in a way, because at one level, you would expect there'd be a degree of continuity in the kinds of policies that states follow. And that's clearly not been the case. It's made a huge difference, the fact that Trump's been the president rather than somebody else. And I think you can make the same argument about China as well, because Xi Jinping has clearly set China on another course from the one it was on before he arrived on the scene. And he's personally responsible for a lot of that change of direction, I think. But the interesting point is, in the United States, this change of direction and leadership has revealed some of the really fundamental ongoing political weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the American system, whereas in China, despite what Gordon was saying, I think there's a groundswell of support for the Xi administration and of the government that does exist in the same kind of unified way in the United States, where there's huge polarization still. And I think whatever you think about China's foreign policies and its assertion and its aggression in the international system, from Xi's perspective, that's quite a significant advantage. The fact that there's no real opposition and there's much greater support and unity in terms of his leadership than there is just about anywhere else you might like to mention, but particularly in Trump's America.
Yeah, there's some really interesting, that's a really interesting point there about the power of the leadership when we're reflecting on markets and the business community. So we do have market demand and good business partnerships, yet the leadership matters so much, and Trump really did have quite the impact in that space. So I was seeking to bring Dan Hu into this conversation to provide some insight here into the business partnerships and the economic relationship.
Well, I have to say that definitely Gordon is in a much better position to tell about the sentiment of the American business towards China. And I would have to say that from my end, I think it's slightly different. I don't think it's that pessimistic in the same way with Australian businesses, and because I've been talking with Australian and also Austrian and all these organizations based in China. But there are 2 points I like to make. The first one is really about that I come to feel that one of the greatest deficiencies of our discussion or discussion in English language on the treatment of foreign China and also trade measures and everything, I think they tend to look at it in the sense that China has been a beneficiary of joining the WTO and all these things. And I think they have neglected one important thing, is that export or buying things from overseas will actually put great pressure on companies in China or on Chinese companies. The Chinese consumers definitely benefit a lot, but what about the Chinese manufacturers? So I think it's really important to bring that into this landscape as well, is that export does have winners and losers, and imports too. When we import things from overseas, we have losers as well. And China has huge problems to deal with, including poverty and all these things. So I think that's really something important to put into the landscape. And the second point is really about Gordon's point about this sort of over the board of public opinion shifting the things. And I'd like to contribute a little bit, is that I would argue that this exactly shows how powerful and how widespread our whole discussion has been conducted in the English language, and how our media and also social media has controlled everything. I would argue that it's pretty much a reflection of that, because earlier this year, we did a media analysis on Lowe's COVID survey, and we found it very interesting is that for the Australians, they tended to rate Britain's handling of COVID very high, while Italy very, very low. But when you were looking at the numbers of confirmed cases in those countries, UK far exceeded Italy. So what we were thinking is, what is going wrong there? And so why Australians were having this misconception about what is going on in other countries. And then we went to ABC, which is really the media that the respondents identify as the main source of information prior to the survey. And we found that ABC's representation of the UK's handling and Italy's handling is pretty much skewed. It's like Italy, every time you would hear words like mess or epicenter, but with UK, every time you see a very determined Boris Johnson over there, having everything under control. So I just want to contribute that I would think the media would have that power as well, would play that role.
It's a really good point to raise, particularly when we reflect on the end of the Trump era and the fake news era that we've had. But more globally, the role that the media has in disseminating information and also crafting public opinion. Does anyone else want to add to those points that were made there?
So can I just say, I don't disagree with Dr. Hu at all. I mean, that is an issue, but I would be really hesitant to dismiss a broad-based and robust and demonstrated public opinion shift just on the media. That's almost like Trump saying fake news, fake news, fake news. It's largely in response to actions that have been taken. So in the last 2 weeks alone, you know, when what we now call wolf warrior diplomats, right? When the ambassador of China in a democratic society releases this 14-point, list of specific complaints against Australia and all the things that Australia must do if it wants to repair its relationship with the United States, that is a message which is aimed at an audience in Beijing. It's not aimed at social media in Australia. That's not something you blame on Facebook or you blame on the media. These are decisions made in Beijing. So I'll go back to what I said at the very beginning. I actually, because I spent 25 years in Washington before becoming an Australian citizen and spending the last 7 years in WA, I tend to look at things from both perspectives. I brought with me from Washington an inherent skepticism about the long-term trajectory of China, what you don't have in Australia, because U.S., Japanese, Taiwanese, South Korean businesses do business in China. They do business, whereas Australia largely does not do business in China. Australia does business with China. It's commodities, it's transactional at the border. And as a result, Australia has not been nearly as affected by the internal changes, internal law changes, surveillance, et cetera, in China as the rest of the world has. So we wouldn't expect the Australian business community to have the same response as the American or European business community, because it's different. Their experience is different in terms of that process. But in the end, those things have had an impact. Changes in China have had an impact on public opinion. And again, if it was just Australia, I might think we had a problem. But Australia is not an outlier here. We're one of almost everything in the broader community. And to give full credit to President Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership, they are not stupid. They know full well, and Mark alluded to this, that they're facing some really difficult choices coming down the pike. The demographic problem, the overall slowing down of the economy, legitimate the party, and they're doing what they need to do to strengthen their system. I just think it's the wrong thing. They're tightening the role of the party, making the leader a leader for life, increasing surveillance, and cracking down on reforms, reversing the Deng Xiaoping consensus. So the core of the answer, I think, is the international reaction is a reaction to China changing. It's a reaction to China reversing the Deng Xiaoping consensus, not a reaction against the Chinese people or academics or businesses. So.
Professor Tao Shi, what do you, what's your response to Gordon on that?
I was just going to add a couple of points. One is this public opinion thing. I did a paper back in 2013, and what I found in that paper still is pretty much true today. That is, it's a very striking pattern in developed countries. Public views of China tend to be much less favorable compared with public views of China in developing countries. And so my presumption that, maybe publics in developing countries, they tend to look at China with more admiration because of China's economic success and others, right? And so this is my speculation because we don't have individual level data to run multiple regression analysis. The same thing you look at, I think one of the most frequently cited public opinion poll is released by Pew Global Research a couple of weeks ago, and which also shows that Chinese image was pretty negative in most Western countries, like Gordon pointed out. But again, I would say perhaps if you have similar samples from developing countries,
agreed.
You could see perhaps a very different picture. So publics there may have a much more favorable view of China. Second, Gordon mentioned about this, what is wrong. It's driven primarily by the decisions made by Beijing. I think this is largely true, but also you have to understand, I would kind of disagree that how elite, for example, how actions and behavior and rhetoric from Beijing are disseminated, interpreted, and framed by mainstream or fake news, whatever, social media, into each individual country, and how those interpretations and frames and then are absorbed by recipient audience. So there is absolutely a large degree of elite influence. So in that sense, it's not just completely or primarily the actions and rhetoric here, but also a very important part played by local elites in influencing their own recipient audience perception of China.
Just on that, I do have a question that's come through about how much do you think concerns around human rights and around changing arrangements for the governance of Hong Kong have influenced the relationship, mainly between Australia, I guess, and China?
It's a question for me again?
Yes, if you're willing to answer it.
Yeah. Well, we all know this was big news in 2000, big issue in 2019 and even before the protest in Hong Kong. We hear, again, you all know the Chinese government's position on this. This is part of China's sovereignty. And so China has absolute authority to assert control over what is happening on the streets of Hong Kong. I think for many Chinese, let me tell this from the perspective of many people around me, people who may not be as well educated as I am, and some people who are better educated than I am. And their view is that, look, this is absolutely, violence. This is disorder. This is a rioting. Now, if you are the leader of any country in the world, such as the United States, look at Portland, Minneapolis, right? This is a pure law enforcement issue. It's not an issue of human rights and democracy. So that's why from the perspective of many of my friends, they say United States is adopting a double standards. So when you have similar protests, you say, oh, that's about law enforcement. But when we have a similar situation in Hong Kong, you say that's about human rights and democracy. So that is where these charges and criticism of hypocrisy, double standards come in. And I do believe that Western media and some Western observers of China, they do need to think about this implicit double standards judgment of China and their own country.
It's really interesting because it lends itself back to the earlier discussions about the representation in the media and how that actually feeds into public opinion and some of Dr. Hu's findings there. I'd like to bring in Mark Beeson to ask if you had any comments to add on to that, Mark, if you're still there. I think you might have frozen.
China's.
I think he's.
You want to turn your mic, Mark, so we can hear you.
And I have to say that China's behavior, its attitude, its kind of proprietorial view of its relationship with Hong Kong, Taiwan, the Uyghurs, Tibet. I mean, there is a case to answer, I think. I don't think there's any doubt at all that China's been behaving badly domestically towards the Uyghurs, for example. And I don't think most people around the world are not terribly sympathetic to China's view of the status of Taiwan, for example. A lot of people find it hard to...
Oh. Mark, you're breaking up.
Oh, okay. It's probably just as well, I suspect,
Yes.
in what I'm saying. But yes, I think. No good. Can you hear me or not?
Not very well, so I will have to move on. But yeah, I think we're starting to pick up what you're saying. But I'll move on, and I've got a couple more questions around the economic relationship, really, that will stem from the Biden presidency. And I was wondering if any of the speakers wanted to speak about how the Biden presidency might reshape the economic relationship between China and the US, and then what those implications might be for Australia.
So let me chime. I'll be very brief on this. Our director of research, Dr. Jeffrey Wilson, has been nonstop on media and other writing on this for the last 6 months, because that's his real area of expertise. Australia has actually not fared well under the Trump administration's approach to China, because the Trump administration's approach to China was very transactional, right? He didn't really care about reform in China, which means he didn't care about the Chinese people, right? Traditionally, Americans were working together with Europe and with Australia and Japan and the rest of the world to say, hey, we want China to abide by fundamental intellectual property or other things in the world for the benefit of China and the world, right? The rules, right? The Trump didn't care about that at all, right? All he wanted was to be seen to be a deal maker and to win. So his approach to China was very transactional and very specific commodities in terms of barley and a bunch of other things. And so you've got a situation where China has agreed to that relatively easy transactional approach instead of the more difficult underlying economic reforms. And in order to meet the US requirements, they're going to have to import less from other countries. And so sector after sector, we've been able to kind of demonstrate, or at least my colleague Jeff has makes, at least there is some linkage between Chinese decisions to import from the US and their decision or their willingness or the relative ease to block products coming out of Australia. So that's obviously not good for Australia or Australian farmers or for the US or candidly for China. And so what we really have to focus on is reestablishing what Australians refer to as a rules-based order. And that really comes to how trade is organized, how the economy is organized. And that's something we really have not seen for much of the last 4 years. And I'm hopeful that we will see going forward. I think China's decision to continue to support RCEP, the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership, is a very positive development. Australia is part of that. ASEAN is a major part of that. That's really good. I would note, however, that a lot of the actions we've seen this year in terms of the bilateral Australia-China relationship economically have been in violation not only of the new requirements of RCEP, but of our own bilateral free trade agreement between Australia and China. So the rules matter, particularly for smaller countries like Australia.
Gordon, thank you for that. I'd like to sort of follow up a little there with Dr. Dan Hu, particularly with Australia. Can you provide us a little bit more of insight into that from your perspective?
Yeah, so just first, I just want to echo what some of our panelists have said. I think it's Gordon who said that Australian businesses may have very different experience or sentiment when compared with the American ones. And I can tell you that's definitely true, because when the China-US trade war just started, I was invited by Austrian Shanghai to do a panel discussion. And the funny part about it is that all the Australian businesses there that day were asking just one question: what can we get from that? What can we get from the trade war with China? I think it pretty much shows that. And I just want to point out one thing which really deals with multilateralism and all these things, commonality between China and Australia, is that actually back in 2018 and 19, China was initiating this commonality of WTO reform and all these things with Australia. I think it was a very important part of the high-level dialogue at that time. And then when we look at the situation on the side of Australia, we're seeing something quite different. I know the trade numbers are growing, but the thing is, China's a huge market. And also, don't forget that the iron ore prices have been going up and up. I think that's pretty much of the value thing. And also when you look at the foreign direct investment, which was really a very important concern, and one of the starting point for China to initiate CHAFTA and to finalize it was never got around. And when you look at the FDI regulation shifts, the policy shifts since 2016, and you are seeing Australia becoming more, at least cautious, if that's not an understatement, of Chinese investment. So with that, again, like what I said just now, I think it's really, really going to be tricky for the future.
Mm. Professor Wu, can I ask you to follow up on that with some thoughts about what this change perhaps in foreign policy might mean for Australia and its economic relationship with China?
Okay, thank you very much, Amanda. Maybe just a couple of quick points. I think the first point I would like to add to the panelists about the under the Biden administration. I think one thing which is certain is more predictable, because under the current Trump administration just seems so unpredictable, so many uncertainties. So predictable in the sense either good or bad. I think that both the President Biden and President Xi share the same, I think that they both believe multilateralism. I think that in the coming years, the two governments probably will sit down and talk more instead of fighting with each other. A second point is I agree with Gordon about the US business, Australian business, in terms of their business in China, they're different. One huge difference which we often don't pay much attention is that between the US and the China business relationship, US enjoyed the huge surplus. While we look at China and Australia, Australia enjoyed the super surplus. So that's why one of the factors which determines that the two relationships are very different. The last point I wanted to make is really to Australian business and policymakers, if they are in the audience. I'm really concerned about the future perspective. Apart from the political relationship currently, also because of now in the that impact only in the short run, so for example, the impact on agricultural products and so on. But in the long run, China will face the transition from to deindustrialization. Basically, there will be a time, say maybe 10, 20 years, China doesn't need so much iron ore and steel. At the moment, Australian exports, more than half comes from iron ore. So in the future, to prepare for the transition in China, Australian business really has to expand in other areas and sell more other products in the Chinese market, maybe other markets as well.
Mm. It's a really interesting point. I've got one more question that I wanted to ask Mark Beeson, and that's a great segue for me. So thank you, Mark. You made some comments about climate change and perhaps the green economy here, and how the Biden presidency perhaps could shape or open up opportunities for some more discussion about our future as a globe and a world, and what that might mean in leadership. So I'm asking you if your internet's working. I can't see you moving. Hopefully you're there to provide some comments around that.
Oh, it's blind. Okay. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'm always. Am I still going or?
We can hear you.
Not. Okay.
Okay, we can't hear Mark.
I think the potential for useful. Oh. No.
No, Mark, we're struggling with you. Sorry. I'm going to have to ask. Is there anyone else on the panel that's able to address that issue about what the Biden presidency might mean in terms of some new economic activity and addressing the issue of climate change?
Well, so this is where I tried to make that point in my opening comment, and it was the source of some of the optimism I had at the beginning, right? Under President Trump, the relationship was very, one-dimensional. It was just on the relationship, and it was really about mano a mano. It was about two leaders who were more alike than different, right, in terms of that process. I'm confident that there will be underlying tensions about technology, about South China Seas, about territorial issues, about human rights, about Uyghurs. All those tensions are not going away. But what there will be, which we did not have under the Trump administration, is at least the potential for cooperation. The Trump administration was hostile to anything multilateral, anything global, anything UN related, and certainly anything that was environmentally related. And so if you look at the Biden appointments to date, the most high-profile appointment he has made is former Senator, Secretary of State, presidential candidate John Kerry as a climate czar. Clearly indicating that's going to be a major priority, and you cannot have a serious global discussion about climate change without working together with China. So all of a sudden, there's this major field where we can cooperate. In fact, we must cooperate. I would also add health to that. International health is going to be an area where you can't do it without China. And it's been highly antagonistic because, again, part of this, whatever the real questions may be about the initial phase of response to the virus, right? But that also doesn't mitigate the later mistakes by the U.S., and that became highly politicized. I think that will be an opportunity for collaboration, and that in general, internationalism. So China in recent years has been in the strange position as, at least vocally, verbally, being the defender of the international system, because Trump has been attacking it. So I don't want to overstate it, but there is potential there, particularly in climate change.
That's an excellent wrap up there, and thank you for making that point. Look, I've thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. There's been some great questions and some really good answers. We're running low on time, so I'm going to throw back to Professor Sagar. But prior to that, it turns out we do have Professor Greg McCarthy back online. Greg, are you there at all?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry for
Excellent.
Sorry for the dropout. My computer seemed to give up on me. But again, I'd like to thank Professor Sagar for putting this on, and his team have been fantastic. Equally, I'd like to thank you, Amanda, for chairing this in a brilliant way. And finally, I suppose we have to again reflect on Beijing Foreign Studies University and its leader, Professor Sun. Without Professor Sun, we wouldn't have this interrelationship between BFSU and University of Western Australia, and also between Australia and China. So he's the president of the Australia-China Association in China, which has 40 different branches in 40 different universities. So we're reaching out to a big audience in China. I think that's good. And again, I'd like to thank everyone for being involved, and sorry for my computer giving up on me.
Thank you very much, Greg. And now over back to Professor Segar.
Amanda, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Amanda, thank you for that magisterial chairing of this discussion and the very lively contributions that you were able to sort of navigate your way through. So I'm sure the audience has benefited from that. I've just got a couple of sort of housekeeping and related points. First of all, to obviously thank our esteemed and if I may say so, pretty well-informed panel. I mean, this is the point of these exercises, getting people to comment upon developments on the basis of having thought about them, having observed them, and actually sort of considered them. So I think that's self-evident. And I also make the point, and in fact amplify the point that Greg was making a moment ago, which is that unless universities such as UWA have these very important relationships, in this case with the BFSU in Beijing, but there are many other relationships, of course, we hold internationally, it's kind of difficult to get events like this off the ground. I mean, we can do it, there's odd sort of networks, but ultimately I do believe it's very important, speaking just on behalf of Australian universities such as ourselves, that we need to be on the front foot and be proactive, and the sort of work that Gordon and others have been doing in terms of building those networks. So there's a lot more for us to contribute to that actually works on the best practice that this example, this collaboration has illustrated this afternoon. So we're ambitious, and I'm very grateful to Greg and his colleagues. And the last point I'd just like to make, if I can very briefly, is to go to, I think, Professor Zi's point, but also it cropped up, I think, in Professor Wu's point around, how, I think he was sort of saying, as the facts of Australian trade change in the future, and as China may source its raw materials from other places beyond Western Australia, we should at least be prepared to reassess how we look at these relationships. These things are not static. Less than a generation ago, there was very low levels of trade between Australia and certainly WA and China, and we would have had a very different perspective. So I do urge all of us to be sort of keep our mind open to how these facts to do with trade and economic relationships themselves may change. And then the last point, I think most important of all, is this has been a fantastic advertisement for what I call informed China and US reading. The reading of these countries and their motives and their thinking. I think the point was made by Professor Z very early on. He said we have to reassess what we think of Democrats. Then he extended it to say, well, maybe Republicans as well. But in fact, sorry, it was the other way around. Reassessing it on the basis of, are we using common units of analysis? Are we actually using the same language? I mean, this very sensitive question of, is something that appears on the screens of Western households, you know, is these sort of law and order matters, or are they to do with, you know, social justice and grievances? People like me, and hopefully others, would say, well, very possibly both, in both countries. And unless we, in this panel and this discussion, leave open the possibility, the probability that both things are true in how people perceive what's going on in China, what's going on in the United States, we may run the risk inadvertently of talking past each other. And that's the last thing we want to do through a forum such as this. Look, it's 2 minutes to go to 2:30. The most important thing I can do at this stage is thank everyone once more, and then to very, very promptly shut up and allow everyone to get on to whatever they've got planned for the rest of today. And it's been our great pleasure to co-host this afternoon's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.